If this episode takes you back to your childhood, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells YouTube there are more Gen Xers out there who still remember what it was like to grow up before the internet. Let me ask you something. What was the one toy you wanted more than anything else as a kid? The one you circled in the Sears wish book or whatever wish book KB toy stores, what have you, whatever was available at the time, but the one you couldn't stop thinking about. The one you hoped would be under the Christmas tree, the one that kept you up all night before Christmas. Santa be damned if you were awake when he got there. It just was tough to fall asleep. That toy, what was it? If you were a Gen X kid, you didn't need Wi-Fi. Smartphones, nah. You know what you could do? You give us a cardboard box, handful of action figures, and tell us to be home before dark, and we'd disappear until the streetlights came on. Today, we're opening up the toy box. Not just to remember the toys we had, but to remember the imagination that brought them all to life. Christmas was a national event as a kid. All that wanting, wishing, waiting, hoping that your Christmas was better than the next guy's. All of us Gen X kids, we didn't have the World Wide Web, Amazon, or any of those things that we have today in order to be able to discover toys, to get inspiration for what it was that we wanted. No, we had each other. Maybe another kid in the class had something we didn't have that we thought was really cool, went over to play at their house and was like, damn, where'd you get this? But most of the time, we were flipping through the pages of, say, a Sears wish book, JCPenney catalog, TV commercials. They were our saviors when it comes to trying to figure out what it was that we wanted for Christmas or for birthdays for that matter. But more importantly, we got a lot of our suggestions and a lot of the influence of what toys to purchase by watching Saturday morning cartoons. Here's a fun fact, and I'll be peppering you with these fun facts throughout this episode. So this one, the Sears Wish Book, debuted in 1933, believe it or not, and became the Amazon catalog of its day. Millions of kids spent weeks circling toys and folding page corners. How many of you can still remember the exact page where your dream toy lived? That far back, I'm pretty sure it's impossible. And I do remember that those catalogs were like an inch thick. So, and it wasn't just toys. I'm pretty sure they came out with one especially for toys, but I faintly recall that. So in the beginning, there was Star Wars. Now, as far back as I can remember, I'm pretty sure that Star Wars was one of the number one things that I was hoping to see under the Christmas tree. But there is some interesting tale to be told about Star Wars action figures and the Star Wars toy line in particular. So when the original Star Wars movie was released back in 1977, I was just a toddler. I didn't really get on the Star Wars bandwagon, so to speak, until a little bit after Empire and then right before Return of the Jedi. So I think I had a mixture of the Hoth toys. I believe that Empire Strikes Back had been out for maybe a year or so. I didn't actually see either of the first two episodes in the movie theater. However, I did see Return of the Jedi later on. In any case, when that movie was released in 1977, there were no action figures available. So Kenner was licensed by Star Wars to produce said action figures and whatever toys that they could imagine based on blueprints and all the storyboards that George Lucas had put together. Now, the problem was that he was so tight to the chest with the making and the filming of Star Wars that he didn't want anything leaked out. So in order to do that, he waited to the absolute last minute to allow Kenner to start producing and making those toys. Now, when Christmas rolled around, Star Wars had already been out for a little while, and Kenner was trying to do some catch up. So really, all that happened was kids would get an empty cardboard box promising action figures later. And parents had to literally buy a certificate for toys that didn't exist yet. So imagine that. These early bird certificate packages, they called them, became one of the most famous toy promotions in history. The following year of the release of the movie, those promises were actually kept. And people received 4 individually wrapped action figures for that first set. So if you think about that, it's kind of like if you were to compare it to something that, happens today, pre-orders and Kickstarter culture, you're buying into something that you don't necessarily have yet. And I can't even imagine as a kid waiting around for those toys to show up. I guess you just having a Christmas all over again. But I think I'd be severely disappointed if I pulled a package up under the Christmas tree, unwrapped it, and just found this empty box that said Star Wars. And yeah, that would have sucked. So I happen to have a couple of the Return of the Jedi versions. And if you remember, there was a point in time where you could mail in so many UPC symbols, so incentive to go out and buy more action figures. But if you got enough of them and you sent them in, you get a specialty item that they didn't normally sell in mass production. One of those things in the beginning, at least for the Return of the Jedi, was the Emperor. And unfortunately, his cane's gone. But that was something interesting that I thought that Kenner did. And it was actually pretty smart. Later on, as the movies would progress, Hasbro would end up taking over and carrying the torch for Kenner. There's a documentary on it. You can go watch it. Now, moving on to the toy commercial era, this is where things get interesting. And this is before the 80s. And federal regulations back then heavily restricted cartoons that existed primarily to sell toys. Now, I didn't even know this was a thing. I mean, it makes sense looking back on it that they would do that. But I guess one good example of that would be like G.I. Joe. But G.I. Joe didn't even come out until much later after the original 11.5-inch dolls came out to compete with Barbie. So that's another story in itself. But as you and I remember, when He-Man, Transformers, G.I. Joe, My Little Pony, and Jem exploded onto the TV, all that changed. So what you had was people running to the stores, buying these toys at random, and they had a place for them. The difference between Star Wars and, for instance, like a cartoon is Star Wars was considered to be a one-off. And most of the time people were buying toys based on cartoons. Cartoons were long running. They had an opportunity to continue to sell toys because they had that continuous advertisement going on. Kenner took a big leap in investing in the Star Wars line just based on the fact that there's only one movie. That movie is going to last, 3 or 4 months. And then the shiny and new rubs off. And what do you got? People forgetting. Fortunately for them, Star Wars lasted for a very long time, and they were able to commit to the process and rake in millions of dollars because of that. But not everything works out that way. But when it comes to cartoons, they were just one big, long toy commercial. Granted, they were good toy commercials, 30 minutes long, very interesting, very fun to watch, but commercials nonetheless. But many cartoons weren't even based on toys. The cartoons were created to sell the toys, something that I didn't know. And so for Gen X kids, the commercials weren't really necessarily interrupting the show because the show was, like I said before, one continuous commercial. So we'll call this part of the episode the toy arms race. So giant play sets come to mind when I think about toy companies vying for our affections, so to speak. And I think where they miss is the fact that a lot of those larger toys, for instance, the USS Flag from G.I. Joe, the USS Flag was 7.5 feet long, and it was the G.I. Joe aircraft carrier. And it was probably one of the biggest play sets that they ever put out. So Hasbro made a killing on that. But the thing about it is a lot of us, myself included, never had something that large. And in some cases, you don't have a place for it. You would have to have its own separate room, its own separate zip code, because it was so damn big. And it carried so much stuff. And I'm sure that it carried a large price tag as well. So probably another reason why myself and a lot of others that I know never even set eyeballs on this thing. But it does to this day remain one of the largest toy playsets ever sold. And many kids never got one because it literally wouldn't fit in the house. Did anybody actually know someone who owned one? And how about toys that created panic? How about them lawn darts, weighted metal spikes? You know, lawn darts crazy. And I didn't even think twice about it. I remember throwing those things straight up in the air. I mean, what else were you supposed to do? I guess throw them down, but what's the fun in that? I think we were all kind of doing a little risky behaviors back then, and were almost welcoming getting injured in some way, shape, or form, because I do remember being spread out. You know, there'd be like 5 or 6 of us, and we'd all each have one, and we'd throw them up in the air. And I think we'd dare each other to stay in the same place until they all came down. What idiots were we? But what a great time that was. Clackers. I don't know about toy safety in that case. It's more like toy nuisance for the most part. It's like giving your toddler a drum set when he's 4. Just not a wise decision. But the chemistry sets actually used real chemicals. I mean, you could literally burn yourself with some of this corrosive liquids that they were selling with these sets. Easy Bake Oven actually used a heating element, but of course it was just a very, very high watt light bulb, incandescent bulb. And then came video games. So I think toys changed quite a bit, not just with cartoons coming into play and those becoming so popular. And then in some cases, you know, turning into some of the worst movies I've ever watched. But hey, who doesn't love a good Masters of the Universe? It's so good, in fact, that we decided we were going to make another one for this generation. I hope it's better than the last one. I love Dolph Lundgren. I think he did some great work in Universal Soldier and Rocky IV.
I must break you.
Atari 2600. It was released in 1977. You can't forget Nintendo's in there as well. ColecoVision. Who remembers ColecoVision? I think every friend that I had in the neighborhood had a different version of some kind of gaming entertainment system. It's almost kind of like what we have today, right? I think we've narrowed it down to the Wii, Switch, PlayStation, and Xbox. And back then it was Atari, Nintendo, ColecoVision, Intellivision, and that's just to name a few. But at that moment when video games were implemented, it was just another way to market more toys. If you think about some of the games that we've seen in our lifetime in this generation, there had been a lot of movements towards turning those video games into toys. But then not all of it was mind-numbing from watching cartoons or from playing video games. A lot of the stuff that we played with, you had to have imagination. You had to have something going on up here. And when you grow up and maybe you don't have a lot of toys, there's always something you can turn into a toy. But when we talk about toys where using your imagination and being creative, I think back to stuff like Legos. Now, you think about the Legos that are out today, you know, you pretty much get these really cool versions of these sets. And I won't knock a Lego, but I'll tell you what, when Legos first came out, I wasn't good at building. I mean, but you didn't have to be. What you had to be is just have a good imagination, and you can say whatever it is that you want it to be, and that's what it was. If you made this weird lopsided square and you called it a house, hell, it was a house. So it doesn't have to be intricate. It doesn't have to come from something, you know, in the instructions where here's a blueprint on how to build the X-Wing. And I know I have some friends today that just loves them some Lego Star Wars and puts together some of the most intricate time spending sets that I've ever seen. And in fact, I mean, if anybody's been to an actual fully dedicated Lego store, they've probably seen some really cool shit. And I can tell you that I've seen the Millennium Falcon, and it took up a whole entire table. I haven't seen anything like it since, but I'm in awe of what you can do now, you know. And I mean, they moved into the Bionicles and all these different things, and I didn't even know they created a certain language just to for that line of Legos. But if you think how far Legos have come from just throwing them all on the floor, stepping on them, or having your parents yell at you because they stepped on them. And I'm sure you've probably stepped on a few yourself of your kids. So what comes around goes around. But in any case, Legos came from a place where ingenuity had to be the center point, because in the beginning, the Legos didn't have the interconnecting function that they have today, or what you remember. Before, it was just a hollow square. Now you'd have the circles on top. I'm not even really sure why they had them on there, but then they made the tubes, so one would fit inside of the other, and you can put one halfway on the other. But they weren't always like that. And then somebody got hold of it and said, you know what, we're going to evolve this. And that's one thing that Lego has done since the beginning, was evolve as time went on. Good on them. I think there's something like 450 billion pieces that had been sold over the last 40 years, which is pretty amazing. And here's a fun fact. Legos comes from the Danish word, and yes, because the guy was from Denmark that invented them, but the Danish word Lego means play well. And I also just found out that it means to assemble or to build something in Latin. So go figure. Now, Lite-Brite, I had no idea how creative you could be with just a polystyrene tube that's about, half inch and a light behind a bunch of holes. So the interesting thing about that is that in the beginning, first off, 3 guys walking down the street. I can't remember what the location was, but I think there was a department store, and they always do those window dressings. And there was something in there that caught their eye that made them brainstorm how to put the Lite-Brite together. And so a couple of guys, they dismissed it. But the third guy, he said, you know what? I'm going to figure it out, because their biggest worry was, there's going to be small pieces. People are going to choke, or, there's going to be some issues. One of the things was you put them in a hole, and they light up when you put it in the hole. But the problem is, and in the beginning, before they fixed it, was that all the holes that weren't filled by one of the colored little pegs, we'll call them, it was still white light, because that's all it is. It's just a regular standard bulb behind there. So what they did was, during the molding process, they made it so you could slide like a black piece of construction paper or whatever, something that can be perforated if you punch a hole in it. And so that's how they created the light effect to be more enhanced, so to speak, and not see all the white light from all the holes that were still empty. The Viewmaster is interesting because it had been already somewhat used for 100 years prior to somebody turning it into the Viewmaster in 1938. Because in 1838, they already had stereography, which is what it is. And it's basically putting 2 pictures side by side and seeing them through each eyeball separately. And a lot of people don't think about, when they're looking at something, your brain is actually putting 2 separate images together, because even though your eyes, you think they work in concert with one another, they really don't. They are a single entity that's sending one half of an image, or one side of an image, to your brain, and your brain has to combine those 2 in order for you to see depth and get somewhat of like a 3D image. So stereography does kind of the same thing. And so 100 years later, they decided, well, we want to be able to make this for the masses. So in comes one of the greatest inventions of that time, and it's probably still around, and at least it flourished until technology started to be developed. But the Viewmaster was that, and they made it a lot easier for people to obtain. It was a lot cheaper, and it just made more sense. So many of the toys existed, decades before Gen X discovered them. And those are just a couple of examples of those. And it's amazing to me, because games like Simon used to have different names. I think they were going with Follow Me or Touch Me, which probably wouldn't have been age appropriate at the time. But in any case, I mean, Simon still exists to this day, and they have several versions of it. And, they named it after Simon Says. And here's a fun fact about the Simon game is that by the time that they were able to program it and put all the algorithms in there and put the sounds and the tunes and all that they needed in order to complete it, it was right about the time where Steven Spielberg released Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And if you remember, the ship was circle, it had lights, they played the little Simon Says back and forth between the keyboard and the alien spaceship at the end. So it was very serendipitous and 100% coincidental that it worked out that way, because one didn't know that the other was doing that. And what came from it was that the folks that made Simon made millions of dollars because of it. So I don't know about you, but I think a lot of people made a lot of money because of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Now, this part I'd like to call the great toy craze. Every generation has one, of course. And in this particular generation, I think one of the ones that I can think of that I remember vividly, because I used to see the news stories, and if you remember, you'd see them, and it's almost like Black Friday when the Cabbage Patch Kids came out. Parents literally fighting in stores. Now, they didn't have social media back then, so it was all word of mouth and big urban myth and rumors, but who's to say? But that's the story. And so parents would line up, and once that thing was dropped into the store and they started stocking them, they couldn't even get them onto the shelves. People were in there just tearing up aisles trying to get to these toys. But yes, news stations, they covered the toy shortage like breaking news, and that was one of them. And I feel like there was always a method to the madness. I'm pretty sure that, the big companies like Kenner and Hasbro and Ideal and all those back in the day, I think they made only a certain amount. And maybe it's for a couple of reasons. So we'll say the first reason is because, hey, we don't want to go all in on it, because if it fails, we don't want to waste a bunch of money. The second part of that could be a little bit more nefarious, and they say, you know what? We're going to create a frenzy by only putting out a certain number of these toys, and we're going to get the public all in an uproar, and then we'll release them all at once, and then they'll be clamoring, even the ones who didn't want it, because usually it's all about keeping up with the Joneses. And most of the time, the kids had a lot to do with the parents wanting to be a Jones. So then Garbage Pail Kids. Now, I always look at Garbage Pail Kids as trading cards, and of course they were, and it was pretty smart how they marketed, because, some great ideas of the characters, thinking back to all the different ones that I had. It was like collecting baseball cards at the time, and people were nuts. I mean, every time a new card or a new character would come out, it was, and just like you're looking for a rookie card if you're a baseball card collector, and you just keep buying packs. You can't see into the packs, so you don't know what you're going to get. So it was the same situation. You'd have a lot of duplicates, and so there was a lot of trading going on, hence, trading cards. But they also doubled as stickers, and I never did. And I don't know anybody else who did, and that would be peeling the sticker and slapping them on something. For me, I think that was kind of like trading card blasphemy. Why would you screw up a good thing and peel? I mean, because it's done and then it's worthless. So, but I don't think, certain kids just don't care about shit like that, which is fine. They're, hey, I got a sticker. Check it out. I'm going to slap it on my backpack, my folder, my O-Pee-Chee folder, whatever. So not me, though. It was a card. I kept it that way. And I still wish I had them all today. Teachers hated them. And I think my parents did too. And I'm sure yours did as well. I mean, if you think about it, they're pretty crude. And a lot of them were pretty disgusting. Now, they weren't lewd or anything, but there was a lot of borderline stuff going on there. But beyond that, if you want some good, clean fun, you've got Teddy Ruxpin. And I think he's probably one of the first toys to kind of ever feel futuristic. Now, anybody that's ever watched Buck Rogers remembers the weird robot that would follow him around. But that reminds me kind of like Teddy Ruxpin. Essentially a primitive animatronic. So you had yourself a little Blade Runner-esque type of robot of your own. You put your own cassette in it if you wanted. I know the big thing is like, hey, you can pull this cassette out and play it on your radio or your stereo, your Walkman, or what have you. Me, nuh-uh. Teddy Ruxpin was gonna sing Duran Duran. Teddy Ruxpin was gonna sing something other than what he was singing. And I didn't personally own a Teddy Ruxpin, but my younger cousins did. And so we would grab the nearest cassette that we had. Huey Lewis in the News. I think I loved that shit back then. Pop that bad boy in Teddy Ruxpin, and old Teddy was singing some Huey. Fun times. So we had toys that required patience, no doubt. Erector sets. They also teach you something as well. Like, how about an Etch A Sketch? I could never understand how to operate that thing. Now, reading more up on it and understanding the XY axis and all that, and what kind of materials were inside of there, but also at the same time seeing these amazing animations and these drawings, portraits. Insane that folks can actually do that on an Etch A Sketch, but it can be done. But for me, that thing was in the garbage the first year I had it. And I wish I had it today, because maybe I have a little bit more patience, a little bit more time on my hands, and I would have worked harder on making a portrait of a Rembrandt or, Starry Night or something crazy like that. You laugh, but I've seen it. I've seen pictures of it. People do it. So then there's toys that require imagination. And I think action figures were probably the largest part of that, needing an imagination in order to play with them, as well as like Matchbox cars or Hot Wheels. But, you go out into the sandbox and, you build your own forts. You don't even have to play by whatever was scripted in the movie or the cartoon, although that was fun. Hey, let's reenact this. No, you do your own thing. You make up your own stuff. You sit around and you have a little conversation. You're briefing with your friends about, hey, all right, what are we doing today? How's this war going to go down? Right. So like G.I. Joe was an entertainment. You became the writer, the director, the voice actor, special effects department. And the toy was just the starting point. Everything that you had going up here would translate into what you and your friends were doing down there. So here's some quick hits. Hot Wheels were originally designed to outperform Matchbox cars. I'm not sure who won the battle. I can tell you that I probably had just as many Hot Wheels as I did Matchbox cars. I feel like Matchbox was kind of on a higher level, only because they'd been around for a while and they made some high-end cars, where Hot Wheels was kind of, I don't know if they didn't have the license to be, making replicas of some of the vehicles that were out there back then. But I do know that Matchbox did have vehicles that were like the exotic ones. Everybody's looking for a Ferrari or whatnot. These days, it doesn't even matter. I think you can buy Hot Wheels and Matchbox cars that, are any kind of brand name. And maybe they did have to buy licenses for it. I don't know. But what I do know is Hot Wheels came up with a lot of really cool stuff on their own, original ideas, right? It's great. You can have, those die-cast versions of your favorite cars that you see in magazines. But at the same time, you might be looking for something more futuristic, something you haven't seen before. And then that translated into Hot Wheels rides at amusement parks, or the Hot Wheels show at like Universal Studios, and especially the cartoons and all of those amazing things, including the video games. I don't think Matchbox kept up with that. Now, the first Nerf product was definitely not a gun. We know that. It was a foam ball, and it wasn't necessarily a football. It was just a ball. But all of that extra stuff came later, and now you have these amazing high-functioning assault Nerf rifles that shoot 100 rounds of Nerf darts a minute, which is amazing to me. Nerf's come a long way. Rubik's Cube. Rubik's Cube was invented by a Hungarian architecture professor. Guess what his name was? That's right. It was Rubik. Something I didn't know, Stretch Armstrong, the reason that he was able to bend and twist and then go back to his original shapes was because he was filled with corn syrup. Not a clue. And then jumping back to Simon, it was actually originally inspired by the game Pong, because right before Simon was released, Atari 2600, and I think before that there was a gaming system prior to Atari 2600, and I'm blanking on it right now, but that's where Pong originally came from, and then Atari picked it up and ran with it after that. The big wheel. Oh, the big wheel. Some of the things that you could do on that thing. So during the Depression, before the big wheel came out, people were taking their tricycles and they were turning them upside down, including the inventor of the big wheel. And he would adjust the seat and put it so the seat was above the rear axle and the handlebars were just a little bit above your head. And so when they finally did start making the big wheel, that's exactly how they made it. And they made different versions of the big wheel as time went on. I think some of us had those. I believe mine was the Knight Rider, or maybe it was even the Dukes of Hazzard. Maybe I had one of each, because I tell you what, the way that we rode those things around, both like a scooter back in the day, where you'd pull the seat off and toss that thing out, and then, you'd put your hands on the handlebars, bend over, and then just start scooting your ass off. Or you just take the seat off completely. But when they put the e-brake on these things, it was one of the coolest thing ever. And I believe that everybody's had, several hundred drag races in the middle of the street, and those lasted well into the evening. But the big wheel, it was invented in 1969 and became a cultural phenomenon in the 70s. And they made them for quite a while. And there have been different versions of them. There's the ones where you have the different stick shifts to drive the rear wheels, which didn't go over very well. I think everybody just liked the true nature of the old school classic big wheel. So this is how it goes. The greatest toy Gen X ever had wasn't He-Man. It wasn't G.I. Joe. Star Wars, although very great. Legos and Atari, the next best thing back then, wasn't any of those. It all came from up here. The imagination pushed the boundaries of what we saw our toys doing. And that's something that will stay with us for a long time and maybe forever. But the toys gave us a starting point. Everything else, that was us. What toy did you play with until it broke? What toy did you want but never get? And what toy do you still own today? Now, I got a couple samples here. My Star Wars fans out there, I learned a cool little fun fact about this little guy. I don't know if you can see him. That's a Jawa. And so Jawa is he's a simple guy. He's just got this cloak. But what I found out recently from watching that documentary about how the Star Wars toys were made and about all those promise certificates was that the guy wanted to put a cloak on a Jawa, but he didn't have any material. So he cut the end of his sock off and made a little cloak for him. And that's how he presented it to George Lucas's team when he was showing them the different versions of the action figures that they were going to start off with. So, in case you didn't know, now you do. And then, of course, this guy. Now, I'm sad because he's lightsaberless. And it's just one of those things, you buy something 1980 and unless you keep it in the box, you're going to lose those smaller parts. But hey, if you still got some toys today that make you smile, that you want to talk about, and you want to throw down and have a longer conversation about, put it in the comments. But before you go, I'd love to hear your story. Every episode starts with a memory, but it doesn't end until you share yours. So leave a comment, join the conversation, and if you're enjoying these trips down memory lane, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and if you got something to add, let's talk about it. Hey, if this show took you to a place that you thought was long forgotten, don't worry. We've got more where that came from. And if you know a friend that would enjoy it too, grab them up, bring them with you, and we'll see you on the next episode.